Hello and welcome to XPol. There has been some progress and some changes in the past few months that I would like to document here, and there are some announcements that I would like to make. So you could say that this is a housekeeping episode, as this seems to be the canonical term for that kind of thing. And I'm gonna use it to reflect on what I've learned so far, and I'm also going to give you some details about the course that I'm intending on setting for the next episodes. But before I start, I want to express my gratitude to my first 11 guests, both for their time and for their enthusiasm. Even though I anticipated that they might be interested in sharing their work, I did not expect to have such a positive response. Academics especially seem to be eager to spread their ideas to a wider audience, and I'm really happy to be able to facilitate that to some extent. Okay, so new elements have surfaced since episode 0, which was the last housekeeping episode. And with the benefit of hindsight, I now realize that setting a direction for the podcast is better than setting a destination, because I want to remain flexible as I get new skills and new information. So the new things that I've learned in the past few months include the technical and conversational knowledge that I'm getting out of each episode. It also includes the feedback that I get from listeners such as you. And I also take into account my impressions of the evolving state of the podcasting ecosystem just as a simple podcast listener. In the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my thought process. I'm going to let you know the rationale behind the footnotes. I'm going to tell you what I think about hosting and podcasting. And I'm also going to touch on the new features and the future plans that I have to be able to bring as much value as possible to listeners. Okay, so as you can probably imagine, there is a great deal of research that goes into the making of each of these podcast episodes. I think that I have read and taken notes on several thousand pages of articles and academic papers already, both to prepare the conversations and also after the fact when I was working on the footnotes. In some ways, I think that this is a problem because I'm far from the efficient frontier, meaning that I could probably produce much more listenable content in the same amount of time. But on the other hand, the podcast is a passion project. It is essentially a way to turn my curiosity into something that other people can benefit from. And it also allows me to get in touch with people whose body of work I admire and to ask them questions that I deem to be relevant. This is why I don't mind spending a lot of time on preliminary work and also on footnotes, which, as far as I know, are a unique feature of this podcast. Even though I don't think that most listeners consider them to be essential, they are important for me for two reasons. The first reason is that the last thing that I want to do is to spread factoids and falsehoods, which is why I use them as a core agenda. And the second reason is that the footnotes allow me to address the unanswered questions that often surface during the podcast, and they allow me to contextualize information and to clarify and develop ideas that I find interesting. And for that specific purpose, I must say that I'm grateful to live in 2020 for Wikipedia alone, because I use it all the time, and especially when I want to precisely define terms in the footnotes. Something that is unfortunate though about footnotes in general and also glossaries is that they are often featured in fantastically impractical ways in books and in papers, and as a result they are often ignored by readers, which sadly I think is also the case here. The French cosmologist and philosopher Aurélien Barrau made the provocative point that footnotes are often the most important part of the book, and I tend to agree to the extent that they incite the reader to engage with the information at hand proactively and critically, instead of passively consuming it and taking it for granted. Footnotes remind us that claims made about the world vary in epistemic value. Tim Urban of Wait But Why has found a great way to make footnotes accessible to his readers without them getting in the way of the main text. I invite you to check out Wait But Why to see what I mean, but I would love to see such clickable footnotes spread and be implemented in academic papers. And I am currently looking for something that might be an equivalent for podcast, so I'd be interested in hearing your suggestions, and if you have any ideas, I would love to hear about them. Okay, now I'm going to talk about hosting and the podcasting ecosystem as I perceive it at the moment. So I subscribe to Daniel Schmachtenberger's analysis when he says that sense-making is increasingly decentralized, and I'm happy to play a part in this collective endeavor. I understand it to be the result of the world changing at a fast pace in the wake of widespread internet access. News and information don't circulate in as a top-down manner as they once used to. To be clear, I don't imagine that this podcast is going to simply be a string of interviews. It's going to be, And it is already colored by my interests, my biases, my idées fixes, my areas of competence and of ignorance, and more. Far from being a drawback, I think that this is one of the perks of the podcast format. Because each episode is so long, and because I am the host on all of them, listeners have time to form an informed opinion of me and what I'm about, and decide whether they are interested in following the podcast or not. In a way, it's the opposite of soundbite culture and of taking things out of context. Beyond the information that is communicated by the guest, in long-form podcasting, the hosting style directly has an impact on the quality of the finished product. For that reason, I consider a conversation to be much more than a sum of questions and answers. And there is also more to it than being simply well-read and well-researched. It takes flair to be able to weave heterogeneous topics into a coherent whole that is actually enjoyable, useful, and usable by the listener. It also takes self-restraint to keep oneself in check and to avoid interrupting when it's not really making the conversation better, and also to discipline oneself to ask the question that is warranted by the context rather than the question that you've been sitting on for 5 minutes and that you really want to ask. About different hosting styles, new podcasts are created every day, and many guests on these podcasts are serial guests, meaning that they have been interviewed on other podcasts before. And you can see how different hosts bring different things in guests and the profound impact that the style, preparedness, and adaptability of the host have on the quality of a conversation. As a host, I also feel like it's important to take into consideration the fact that your guest has been on other podcasts before and what he said there, because there is no point in having the same conversation over and over again. That's what I tried to do, for example, on episode 8 with Jason Haaheim, when I took his previous contributions into account when I was writing the questions for that podcast to try to build on them rather than making him recount his life story once more. A clear example for me of a host that tries to come up with original questions, sometimes to a fault, is Tyler Cowen and his podcast Conversations with Tyler. He is clearly very well prepared before each episode, but sometimes his questions feel very disjointed. However, I find it very interesting to listen to his podcasts when it features people that I already know, because I often discover a different facet of their expertise and personality thanks to his quirky questions. So these are things that I'm thinking about and that I'm actively trying to refine. And I feel that it's actually tricky to walk the line between over-preparation and under-preparation. I feel like, if anything, I tend to be over-prepared and that it can backfire. For example, I really like my conversation with Calder Hannan. It's one of my favorite podcasts, but I am worried that it might be a bit too technical for people that haven't read the literature like I did. And I wish that we had gone into more detail about some of the concepts that we take for granted. Adam Neely says that he, quote, transcribes other content creators. And in a way, I'm trying to do the same thing. I'm experimenting with different approaches to see what sticks and what is conducive to what I want to achieve with the podcast. And I keep what I like and I get rid of what I don't. So, for example, I find that I rarely get anything from short talks and from Q&As, except when it's directly about some technical subject. And also, I don't get much from generic questions like, for example, what is your spirit animal, or what piece of furniture would you be? So I shortly experimented with that, but I did not really fit my style, so I'm not asking these kinds of questions on the podcast. Something else that I've learned is that the social dynamics are very different depending if you're recording with someone that you know or if you don't know them at all. And also it depends on whether you're recording remotely or if you're in the same room. And of course, the personality of the interlocutor matters a lot. And that's why I'm trying to learn to adapt. For example, if I'm trying to make a subject abstract and they're not into it, I should not flog a dead horse and I should just move on and take a different approach. So basically what I'm saying here is that I am learning on the job and that I'm delighted to see that there has been a steep learning curve since the first housekeeping episode. When I'm working on a podcast episode, I try to be cognizant of the several different levels that are at play at the same time. So what I mean is that I'm trying to make it good as a standalone episode, but I'm also trying to make it a coherent piece of the podcast in general, taking into consideration previous episodes, etc. And I am also, as I mentioned before, trying to make it a part of the podcasting ecosystem in general. Something that also needs to be mentioned is that I am doing everything myself, and while it's very time consuming, especially the editing part, it gives me a lot of insight into the way in which I speak, and it also draws my attention to recurring conversational and lexical patterns. So that's another thing that I am conscious of and that I try to change and improve, and over the past few episodes I can really notice a positive evolution in the hosting style. By the way, I should clarify that when I say podcasting, what I'm referring to is conversational podcasts, meaning shows in the vein of Making Sense, of The Portal, of Rebel Wisdom, of the Joe Rogan Experience, the Knowledge Project, which are all part of this very specific thing in a much bigger and more varied universe. But yeah, these are the shows that I'm inspired by when making XPol, and so these are the ones to which I'm referring. Something else that making my own podcast and being behind the scenes in a way brought me is a sharpened understanding of podcast as a listener, in the sense that I now understand much more the difference between a quote-unquote real conversation and a recorded conversation, because when the red light is flashing and when you're recording, it really feels different and you're aware that you are listened to by other people, and so that can lead people to virtue signal much more than they normally would, or to falsify their preferences. And that's a tendency that I see in myself. I will touch on it later. And that's something that I'm trying to fight against and I'm trying to subvert. But it's definitely interesting to think of other podcasts in these terms, because that just goes to show something that we sometimes forget, which is that we are getting a processed product, and we should keep that in mind. I believe that this kind of conversational podcasting is still in its early days, so it definitely lends itself to experiment, which is why I said in episode 0 that I really appreciate Eric Weinstein's approach, even though it doesn't always work. In other words, I think that the art of the conversation is still underdeveloped, and that there is a lot of interstitial space that is yet to be explored. The reason why I said that is because when a connection is established with your interlocutor, when there is rapport, something can happen. The Shannon-Weaver models breaks down, or I don't know, but you can end up in a zone in which you are finely tuned to the person you're speaking to, and you have the feeling that you just get each other. And usually that's when the conversations start to become very, very interesting. So even though there are also clear limits to language, there is a conversational space that I think we can get to and that is very beneficial for the speaker and also for the listeners. So yeah, I think that this is something that is in the process of being developed, and that's very exciting. And that's why I'm curious to see what widespread podcasting brings to the public discourse, just like I'm curious to see how audiobooks change literature. So I can try to speculate on this, but really your guess is as good as mine. I think that there are some things about it that are really positive, like for example, long-form podcasting seems to promote and encourage a proactive and agentic approach to one's information diet. But on the other hand, you could argue, and you would be right, that the rise of parasociality is very worrying, and also that information bubbles and echo chambers undermine this common cultural basis that we have and drives us apart, and can potentially lead to terrible outcomes and catastrophic consequences. But I guess that we shall see, because as Nick Bostrom would say, as far as technology is concerned, once the ball is out of the urn, there is no way to put it back in. So that's that. For now, the podcast space is not nearly as toxic as social media, and I hope that it continues, but Jaron Lanier in his book 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts warns us that we should enjoy it while it lasts, and that might not be forever. So we'll see. Okay, now moving on to my objectives for the podcast, my vision, and the space I'm trying to create. So, some of my guests have expressed views to which I don't subscribe, and I'd like to clarify my stance on that. Obviously, they are liable for their own opinions and what comes out of their mouth, and my opinions are mine alone and my personal responsibility. So now this is out of the way. To state the obvious, I think that this is this very conversational aspect that makes the podcast interesting. The fact that you don't necessarily know where it's going to go next. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to, as I said before, trying to have the podcast to be as close to a real conversation as possible. So when it happens and when I hear an idea that I instinctively dislike, I'm only going to push back on it if I think that this is conducive to making the conversation better and more interesting. And usually what's going to happen is that I'm going to adopt more of a myotics approach, and I'm going to start questioning my interlocutor to try to better understand what they are getting at and what argument they're making. But the thing is, I'm trying to have thoughtful and erudite people on the podcast. And so the point that they make are often subtle, they are often well thought out, and I want to keep the freedom to change my mind. And I also want to give the benefit of the doubt to ideas that first strike me as wrong, stupid, or ludicrous. And the reason for that is that in my own efforts to make sense of the world around me, dismissing an idea outright is really shooting myself in the leg, because even if I think about it and I reflect on it and I end up sticking to my guns, either way it helps me refine my stance on things, and I believe that it's useful to be able to step in their shoes for a second and understand not only the argument that they're making, but also where they are coming from when they're making this argument. And of course, this is where the whole Steel Manning thing comes from, right? It comes from caring, first of all, in having a well-formed conversation before considering the arguments and the points that are made inside of that conversation. So in other words, I care more about having a well-formed, well-thought-out conversation than necessarily pushing an idea or another. And conversely, I also want to make it clear that I am not wed to my ideas, and I'm pretty sure that if you look closely enough, you can hear me contradict myself already in the first few episodes that I put out. And that's what I was saying earlier. I'd like the podcast to be more of an experimental space, like a lab for ideas, and more like a bowl session. So bowl session is a colloquial term, but it was sort of humoristically and more narrowly defined by the philosopher Harry Frankfurt in his famous paper titled On Bullshit. And so in this paper, Harry Frankfurt writes, "What tends to go on in a bowl session is that the participants try out various thoughts and attitudes in order to see how it feels to hear themselves saying such things, and in order to discover how others respond, without it being assumed that they are committed to what they say. It is understood by everyone in a bowl session that the statements people make do not necessarily reveal what they really believe or how they really feel. The main point is to make possible a high level of candor and an experimental or adventuresome approach to the subjects under discussion. Therefore, provision is made for enjoying a certain irresponsibility, so that people will be encouraged to convey what is on their minds without too much anxiety that they will be held to it. Each of the contributors to a bowl session relies, in other words, upon a general recognition that what he expresses or says is not to be understood as being what he means wholeheartedly or believes unequivocally to be true. The purpose of the conversation is not to communicate beliefs." So of course, I know that this is a lofty goal for a recorded conversation, and I don't expect to get there 100%, but I hope that you now understand better where I am coming from with this. Another reason for which I think it's important to give the benefit of the doubt to new or counterintuitive or upsetting ideas is the fundamental asymmetry between the relative complexity of building an idea up compared to the easiness with which it's broken down. It's really easy to throw the baby with the bathwater and to dismiss a new idea outright because an element of it doesn't agree with you. But it's harder to separate the wheat from the chaff, to steelman the argument and to see what you can get from it even if you don't agree. Okay, so now I'm going to move on and talk about the online platforms that allow you to listen to this podcast and what I think about them. So of course, I'm very grateful for platforms such as Spotify, YouTube or Apple Podcasts that allow me to spread my work to people around the globe. But that should not obfuscate all the problems that come with them and with middlemen in general. So along with the societal issues that they might cause, the diverse algorithms are known to be developed to maximize time on site, as Tristan Harris says. And that leads to perverse incentives for content creators. Veritasium has a very interesting video about the YouTube algorithm that I recommend. My approach goes somewhat counter to that because I know, and it's probably a simple power distribution, but that most of the people that have heard of this podcast listen to a part of an episode or of a clip just once. So that's most of the people. Then there are some people that have listened to a few episodes with some interest. And finally, there might be a handful of people that really checked out several episodes or went deep down and checked out the footnotes and did some more research, etc. And so my goal as a host and a creator is to optimize this podcast for audiences 2 and 3, so the interested and very interested people. Trying to cater to audience 1 would be unfair to people that are really into the podcast because it would tie my hands and it would make it hard for me to create something truly unique and daring. I'm doing this for dedicated listeners and their interest is the one that I have the most at heart. Of course, it's not as if I had a huge audience, I think that at the moment I have around 70 subscribers on YouTube, many of whom are friends and people that I know personally. But I'm confident that the audience will grow as I keep on creating content. And also I'm very wary of taking all of these metrics, subscriber count, views, at face value, and of becoming obsessed with them. Because as I said before, I would rather have 100 passionate and engaged listeners than 1,000 people that are half interested in one of the subjects that I touch on. And there is no real metric for that. As I've said on some episodes of the podcast before, not every view is equal, and some people just listen to it casually while they're doing something else, and other people are just listening to it very intensively while taking notes. So these are two different things, even though on YouTube it looks, one subscriber looks like one subscriber and one view looks like one view. And also, if that approach can repel trolls and other people whose attention I wouldn't want to have in the first place, I don't think that it's a bad thing at all. One thing that I would humbly like to achieve on the longer term for people that are really interested in the podcast would be to become a nexus, directing people from one kind of content that they are interested in and enjoy to another kind of content that they might not necessarily know about, but that might interest them. So as an example of that, it's no mystery that I have a lot of admiration for Sam Harris. And I think that the first time that I heard of him, he was talking about the threats of AGI. And it's only after, upon learning more about him, that I got interested into his other work, be it about atheism, moral philosophy, neuroscience, consciousness, and mindfulness, and that I also got interested and discovered many more things through the people that he had on. So to give you a rough idea, this is the sort of model that I am trying to follow. And as some of you may know, I am personally interested in different areas of music, of science, and of philosophy. So far, the podcast has been more focused on music, but I plan to progressively diversify as I get my foot in the door. Besides, I find that popular music studies are very multidisciplinary and that they are a very good springboard to talk about other subjects and disciplines. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the recent changes in the podcast and the ones that are coming. So, as you might have noticed, the name has changed from the Cross-Pollination podcast to XPol, and the logo has also gotten leaner thanks to my friend Charlotte Labarthette. The main reason behind this housekeeping episode is that I wanted to let you know that I am starting a newsletter. And the reason for that is what I said earlier, that is that I have very little trust in the platforms that intermediate between me and you, that I don't want to play the numbers game, and that I don't want to be submitted to the whims of the algorithms. So at least with the newsletter, you can know every time a full podcast is released, it ends up directly in your mailbox and there is no problem there. So of course you can still subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. But I would rather have you go onto vatiez.com where you can enter your email address and sign up. So that's Vatiez, W like whiskey, A like alpha, T like tango, I like India, E like echo, and Z like Zulu.com. And you also have a link in the description, of course. If you sign up, you'll get an email every time a full podcast comes out, and you'll get an extended version of it with bonus content. You will also get it before the regular version is available online. And of course, it stays completely free without ads, and you can unsubscribe anytime from the mailing list. By the way, you also have download links on my website if you want to get the episodes in MP3. And you also have other content like podcast transcripts and footnotes. So this is what I had to say, and thank you for your interest.